Today on the Perception and Action Podcast, my interview with Scott Sievewright, head MMA coach at Primal MKE. So it's time for a call to action. Hi, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception and Action Podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. Now on to the show. Okay, today I'm happy to be joined by Scott Sievewright from Primal MKE, who I've wanted to have on for quite a while. You know, I've known Scott for a long time, so thanks for joining me, Scott.
I'm even happier, Dr. Rob, so I'll try and hide my giddiness.
So, Scott, Scott's obviously, you're going to talk to us about, ecological approach in MMA. That's kind of where we're headed. But can you tell us a little bit about your background and kind of how you got into these things?
Yeah, sure. Quite a brief one. I started in martial arts quite late in life, in my late 20s, and had a little bit of a competitive career, amateur boxing, kickboxing, MMA, and kind of realized early on it was definitely a young man's sport and not the sport just to hang around in too long as a hobby. So the natural, I guess, what I thought at the time was a natural progression into coaching. However, I found out very quickly that I was in no way qualified to coach. So with that in mind, I went back to school to do a degree in coaching science and athletic development. And although I enjoyed that, it was in my studies and the little side rabbit holes I went down. I initially bumped into a video or came across a video by Trevor Reagan on block versus random practice. Okay. And I think I attribute that to be my initial foray down the this kind of rabbit hole. Lo and behold, I came across Sean Mishka, Mr. Movement Miyagi, his videos, and it all led to the Perception Action Podcast, which, as I've said before, you've taken up a lot of my bandwidth over the last few years. So thank you for that. But that brought me to where I am today. Still trying to figure things out, but trying my best.
Awesome. Yeah. We'll have to draw a diagram of people's back. It's all very, hopefully good bandwidth in a good way. And and so I'm assuming that when you started coaching, you kind of taught in more of a traditional technique, focused skill and drill kind of way.
Very much so. Yeah. I kind of copied and pasted how I'd come along. Obviously, I tried to put my own interpretation of it. And increasingly, it took time, but over a while, I just didn't see the transfer between what we were doing and the routines and the so-called skills and techniques we were working on. They not only didn't they turn up in competition, they didn't really turn up when we put any kind of liveliness into it. And so again, that among the other kind of resources and stuff I started to read, it got me further and further away and trying to find a new approach, and which became now fully the ecological approach. So I decided to step away from my old coaching role, which I was coaching in a friend's gym, and just pretty much go whole hog in on the ecological dynamics and run a little experiment with my partner, Ben Schultz. We opened a gym around 3 years ago, and for better or worse, or if we're doing it properly or not, we're completely committed to ecological approach for mixed martial arts.
Yes, and I believe your slogans embrace the chaos, right?
That it is, yes.
You got part of that. That's I think we kind of joke about that, but part of that's really part of it, right? Embracing the idea that we don't know, that we can't tell exactly people what to do, and how, that there's unpredictability and a complex system and kind of idea, right?
I'm so glad you brought that up early, because I've been using this now that my friend, colleague Greg Souders, he's getting a lot of people reaching out to him. People are calling us to ask what is the game you can play, and I think that's why I'm glad you mentioned it. I think we're kind of missing the point. I don't claim to know that I know exactly what's going to happen when we play such and such a game. And that's the whole point, I guess, of non-linearity and chaos in this dynamic system. That it's more of a set of principles that we're following, and we expect to maybe have the kind of outputs or kind of effect that we want. So my analogy I've been using, if someone tells you exactly how to be a parent, they're lying to you and they don't really know. So, and you have more than one kid and you find it out really quick.
100%. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think I love that. So that's, I think that's a really important point. It's easy to look at this as, okay, tell me the new set of drills I should be using instead of the ones I am now. What game should I be playing? But that's really not it, right? That's not it at all. And, although I say that, and you use one of my favorite examples of kind of a way to coach something like one of the most basic things in MMA and fighting, right, is position stance, right? Mm-hmm. And you watch a lot of people fight, and that's the first thing you see, right? They have the incorrect foot forward, and they stand. And you came up with a kind of a really effective way to kind of get people to get this to emerge, right, in practice.
Well, I think so. And again, it's still a work in progress, but I think it's effective. And in the sense, it borrows from some of the principles of getting students out their head and not really thinking about what their feet are doing. Mm-hmm. And if I put them in a safe kind of little game to play, I mean, I talk about this a lot. We play a little shoulder tap or belly button tag game when someone initially comes in. I really don't need to tell them how to stand. That all, I know I'm already getting the buzzwords out of the way. Buzzword bingo. That tends to emerge pretty organically. They know not to have their feet stuck together. They know not to stand with their back against their opponent. So relatively quickly this appears, and it's really quite nice to watch how over even a space of a short few weeks or sessions, that this real organic footwork starts to emerge.
Yeah. Yeah, no, as I said, I use that example a lot when I talk to people. I love it because it's also I think it's a really good example of using constraints, right? You didn't just pick this out of the air because it looked fun, right? You kind of thought through, what if we make the people do this or that? It's going to encourage this type of behavior. So I think that's really a great example.
Well, I did do that to the start when I think, and a lot of coaches that are getting into the space, which I think more and more, it's becoming, it seems like it's finally taking traction. But I think once we learn about constraints, we tend to over-constrain. And I think I was guilty of that for a long time. Over-constraining to a point that it wasn't particularly authentic either. So now I'm starting to be in a space where I'm trusting it more, and and it's less about teaching for me and more about the learning. So between everything I've read in the last few years, my whole experience, I'm seeing not only my sport and what I'm trying to do through a different lens, but life more generally, if that makes any sense.
100%. I say that all the time. If you really kind of adopt this, then you see everything differently. But I want to get the word you used, and I know other people do, authentic. Kind of what does that mean to you in terms of movement?
Well, authentic to me, I guess, means largely, if I pick a few words here, it would be unpredictable and unscripted. Because that's exactly what happens in a fight. Unfortunately, a lot of our sport, and I get why that's appeared, but it seems to be delivered from this very much a if-then kind of sequence scenario, this kind of prescriptive, from striking, it's very much an emphasis on combinations. And when your partner does this, we're going to slip under there. And it just, so that in itself isn't very authentic. And when we get to more of the grappling aspects in wrestling, that's extremely dynamic, and no two situations are ever the same. So I try and get my learners in that space as much as possible. So I would have to say that maybe if someone was to really scrutinize our practices, they might say, well, that's not wholly ecological. But I think for the most part, we're almost at 100% liveliness and ecologically based.
So when you first started, did you just trying to adopt the ecological approach? Did you just try to have more kind of sparring, and is that kind of, how did you kind of first move into adopting this? I think that's people has struggled with that sometimes, I think. Yeah.
So again, it wasn't. I got the chance to experiment at my old gym, the way I was coaching, and bringing more liveliness into it. And then once I open my new gym, and again, from in my sport, I know there's a couple of coaches that have been preaching liveliness for many years, but it was an opportunity for me to really try and build something from my own understanding and intuitions of the sport. And so again, when I open my new place, what we spoke about before, I think when I designed the games and whatnot, or let me backtrack here. I think part of delivering an ecological program is I've been able to learn how to coach ecologically too. And so what I think's been the most interesting thing for me is when I set the environment and the games up, I'm learning a lot. I'm actually seeing a lot more that I wouldn't have ordinarily seen because I had this very, very one-sided myopic idea of what I wanted to see emerge and happen. So every day I go in now, I'm seeing something new, and in many ways, it's making me a better, more informed coach.
Oh, I think that's great. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, you're exploring as a coach and picking up information. And yeah, I've been talking. There's a couple other interviews I haven't released yet that I've been talking to people, and that observing is such an important thing, isn't it? Learning to kind of be more open, I guess, in what you're looking for in your activities and things like that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So to kind of piggyback onto that, I've changed my expectations too of what happens. So I don't really, I'm maybe making the assumption that learning's happened, but I try not to gauge it on any particular session, so to speak. Learning for me is it going to show up next week? Is it going to start to appear more often? So as far as learning design goes, what my approach is at the moment is have a general idea of what I want to the learners to achieve, and I just get them started, and then we start picking out things. Maybe things didn't go quite so well, or maybe someone came up with a novel solution, and we just kind of direct our attention there. So most of my practices are pretty loose now. I try and give as much autonomy as possible, because mixed martial arts especially is so dynamic. There's so many things to learn that if I try and shoebox everyone into what I want them to learn that particular day, I think that you lose a lot of engagement and creativity.
Right. So you don't come in with a particular, here's how you take someone down, or this is a move, or do you give kind of, do you work on kind of giving people some basic structure or demonstration, or?
Sure. Yeah. And I'll use demonstration very, very loosely. So I'll generally give the pretext that it's just my idea. Here's a couple of options. So they're not completely lost. And of course, when it's beginners, they do feel lost. So I need to give them some kind of idea. But again, with beginners, there's a high risk of maybe injury on the wrestling side of things. People taken down, getting their legs trapped in funny ways and whatnot. So we do try and scale that. It's actually my partner that does most of the grappling sessions, but we'll scale it. So we may start on the knees. We may start with trying to reduce the potential for injury, but try and still keeping it as lively as possible. And then we'll just scale on top of that and add complexity as it goes. What I have found when I throw someone into, there's an appetite for maybe running before they can walk. I know that sounds like a bit like linear, but if it's too overwhelming, I really don't see any benefit for them. So that's my kind of goal, is just ushering people into the right kind of programs that we have.
Yeah. No, I think you're 100% right. It's not the same as kind of progressing through a set of distinct steps, like in a linear one. It's, giving people, scaling the amount of information, the amount of variability, so they can achieve some success and get some the feedback they're getting is useful for learning, right? I think that's the key.
Well, that too, and I think there's a different appetite or tolerance for how much failure someone can take before they're discouraged. I have some kids that come, again, anyone younger than 40. I have some kids that come in and they're never discouraged. You could just thrash them all day and they'll be back first time tomorrow. And then you'll have people who are very, very discouraged if they have, even a little bit of failure. And that's a tough balance, right? Through a room. Whereas I've heard you talk about, your 70-30 rule or whatever, but I am seeing that's different for different people.
Yeah, I agree, Scott. Yeah. I think that, it's kind of a very general thing. And I have the same. Some people I work with, they'll try forever. You could put the hardest. They're happy to. I know it's amazing the difference you get. Yeah, no, well, that's right. So you're kind of scaling up people, and then, when you come into a practice, you have some kind of overall general idea, the kind of what you want to work on, but as you said, you kind of let it go where it will.
Yeah, so I come in with a basic plan. I think that helps too. That there's
Mm-hmm.
some kind of expectation of what the class structure at least looks like, or the practice structure.
Mm-hmm.
We'll get to warming up right away, which is something that I think is, we all rant about how the warm ups can be a bit more representative than
Mm-hmm.
they have been across all sports.
Mm-hmm.
So whatever kind of tools or areas we're going to explore that day, I'll use some kind of I'll use that in a warm up,
Mm-hmm.
and then I'll slowly start introducing and scaling until we get to really quite a live and open scenario using these things. So over time, and I try and get so for an example, if we're practicing a low kick or a variation of different low kicks,
Mm-hmm.
we might go through that. It'll be unscripted, a little dynamic for a warm up, and then we'll go through some scenarios and they'll get lots of chance to find their own kind of solutions to it.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we come into the sparring, there'll be a high focus on that particular movement or solution. So they're getting lots and lots of repetitions, so to speak, to attack, defend, set it up, counter, all these things, but all kind of nudging the volume up on that area. So again, going back to what I was talking about before about over constraining, I think I used to switch too much of the game off. And now something Alan Dunton in a previous podcast I had with him told me, just rather than switch things off, turn the volume up in certain areas. And that's been really helpful for us.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's a great analogy, the way to think of it. And so that's been kind of scaling, turning it up and down. And there's so many things you can turn up and down, right? How variable it is, how much force, how much speed, time, space. Yeah, I think that's a great way to think about it. How do you deal with, you must have people in quite different ability, skill levels, in stages of learning. How do you kind of manage that in a martial arts environment?
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because some people seem to just pick it up so quickly. Mm-hmm. And then that talent, the whole thing of like God-given talent, is kind of a muddy kind of term. I'm not quite sure what that means. So the aptitude for picking up these skills is different. So again, people tend to gravitate towards where that challenge meets them. Mm-hmm. We have a lot of people who they'll stay in the shallow end of the pool because that's where they feel comfortable. And then again, it's not always easy, but we'll either always trying to nudge them into that kind of space where it's optimum. And that's not easy, Rob, because you have a class of 30, 40 people, you can't quite give them this. You have to be more of a generalist, so.
Yeah. And I can imagine, like, if you want to have engagements and things, you have, trying to match everybody and ability must be hard. Like, and not having someone that's way going to overwhelm the other person they're practicing with. That must be a challenge. Yeah.
Well, what we've done, which I think's quite successful, and it was more by accident, that we've made the kind of entry level and beginner foundation programs lively enough that even our more experienced teammates come in and participate.
Okay.
And that's really great because they then serve to help. So I feel like even though maybe it's just myself or my partner that's the head coach, we've got all these kind of generals around the mat. And so I think we've been kind of lucky there that we've just found that balance where it's not just for beginners. It's a kind of mix of all kind of levels. And sometimes we have to make sure certain people don't pair with each other. For the most part, it's been quite helpful how our more experienced people can help,
Yeah. And I think that's a great environment, letting athletes help coach other on. I think that we don't do enough of that. I think it's a demonstration from another partner. Yeah. I know one of the issues we talked about a lot before is with the challenge with your sport is the kind of the safety aspect, right? You cannot do full contact in practice like you do in competition. There's no way you can be fully representative in that regard and still, be ethical about it in any way. Okay, talk a little bit about kind of how you've dealt with that. I know it's something you've been thinking about for a long time, right?
Yeah, I think about it every day, and I'm no closer to solving that puzzle. I'm trying to get closer. So a couple of things that I have to consider is what are the aspirations of each fighter? Is it a young fighter who really wants to come in, see where they can go, take it professionally, make it a life and a career? That's a different cost benefit analysis to someone who just wants to come in and get fit.
Mm-hmm.
So for hobbyists, I don't think there is any reasonable amount of head trauma you can take. So I tend to steer them away altogether. We have several students that come in and they spar every day, but they don't do head contact, and that's good for them. Now, when we start introducing it, again, it's a piece of the puzzle I'm not quite there yet with, because it's somewhat of a contradiction, right? We're trying to be as representative as possible, but we're saying, okay, don't hit each other, don't hit each other hard, don't be very, very light to the head. So yes, again, I'm always open to ideas, but I haven't quite solved that piece of the puzzle yet, other than seeing sparring and training itself as a skill, and over time the ability to bring the speeds up while still keeping the forces down is something that gets a little easier over time.
Yeah, no, I know we talked about it. There's not an easy problem, isn't it? It's not, you can't recreate that full affordance and behavior in practice. But what I think, you mentioned affordances, I think what you're doing really well is thinking about how you're, as a coach, the affordances you're providing to your athletes, right? A lot of martial arts, I think, and other sports, what we do is basically we give the person, like, we deliberately afford the movement they're trying to make on you, right? You let them throw you to the ground or whatever, and not have any other, it's so limited in terms of the field of affordances. I think that's something you're really, really trying to change, right?
Well, especially in the striking sports, and I get it that if we hit pads and bags and stuff, it's very, very safe. But that's really not why most coaches will give the rationale for pads and bags. They think it is developing skill. And from the perspective of the information you're attuning to, I think, I'm starting to see increasingly less value in any of that stuff. We only have one bag. We don't hit pads. And that can come across as if I'm talking about we're just a pure sparring gym, that can almost borderline negligent. And it really isn't. I don't tolerate hard or reckless sparring at all. Now, that's the final piece of the puzzle. Can that ultimately transfer? And I'm trying to find novel ways to do that. But also in MMA, there's a great deal of the sport we can practice without any head contact. So for the wrestling and grappling side of things, I think we can get up to a pretty representative and authentic way to train.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think, I like what you're, talking about, focusing on velocity and picking up these other kind of things than the force itself. And, hopefully it would scale, and you recalibrate if in a competition rather than be something completely different in practice. Yeah.
Well, and I know you don't really like to hear that coaches are say, well, this is all very well, but my sport's different. But I think there is something maybe different about getting locked in a cage with the very real danger of getting your lights turned out. I think that's a constraint, or that's very, very real, and I think it's just nearly impossible to recreate on a regular basis. Yeah,
no, I totally understand. And it's made me think of, for a long time, I've done research on using driving simulators, right? And we can justify all these things, but we cannot possibly recreate the feeling of getting in a crash in a simulator. It's impossible, right? I think you're right. It's, and I'm sure it's probably on a lower level, right, for you. And I think Greg talks about this too. The affordance you have to get over of being hit, and that kind of getting used to that and being thrown down, right? I think I think that's large part of this, right? You have to get used to these negative affordances and treat them accordingly with respect, right? Yeah.
And it's not to say that we don't spar and there isn't head contact and stuff. It's just it's very much an informed choice, and it's a discussion I have with most of my team, especially the youngsters. What I think perhaps is a nice little side effect of these youngsters who maybe don't stay with me as long, or they move town or go to other gyms or what in the future, is that I think I'm cultivating this sense of awareness and respect for brain health generally.
Mm-hmm.
And I know I'm talking out of two sides of my mouth sometimes, because I say, that it's very, very important that we reduce head impacts, but we're still sparring.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I'm jockeying both positions. But if I can have these honest discussions, and again, if it permeates through the team that, hey, listen, we're here to get better and we're not here to rock 'em, sock 'em, I think I'm making a net contribution to the betterment of the sport, at least in my area.
Yeah, no, I think you have constraints, right? To you're working, and I think that the same with like sports like football, right? We're accepting there's going to be some contact, and but we can still try to do the right thing and try to be respectable about it. But yeah, no, I think that's a great point, Scott. So maybe where would you recommend? That's kind of the one big thing I know you've struggled with the ecological approach in your sport, and I think you're 100% right. It's totally different than as this element that's not present. Are there any other ones that are kind of been hurdles for you in kind of using this approach or challenges?
I think one of the biggest challenge, and it's getting easier, largely thanks to yourself and other resources out there. That again, it's getting traction, is that there's a very, very specific, people have this expectation of what to expect when they learn anything, when they learn any sports. So there's a great deal of unlearning to do. So when someone's coming to our school to learn, say, kickboxing on the first day, and I'm not showing them how to kick or showing them how to punch. I'm just saying, hey, try and tag your partner on the shoulder or the belly button, and try and make sure that they can't tag you. And there's only a couple of ways we could do it. You can either block, you can redirect, or you can move, and that can probably come off as a little bit, what did I sign up for here? Because the internets, the Instagrams, the YouTubes is all full of these, technically detailed kind of drills and whatnot. So that's hard to push back on, but it's getting easier, and it's getting easier as my students and team are developing, and the ones that have been there for a few years that have never been explicitly taught how to do anything. It all comes. I mean, I'll give for example, for a kick, I'll say there's a couple of things I'm looking for. We're going to lift the leg and we're going to turn it over. But I think one of the things that's jumped out to me most, Rob, is that when I give too much instruction, I don't know if I'm using this right, but it's almost like this cognitive middleman that they have to go through, and they think, you can almost hear the gears turning in the head, and it's so clunky and slows them down. So just by nudging them and giving them that goal to do something without emphasizing how they should be doing it, for me, that's where the real magic's occurring.
Yeah. No, I know exactly what you're talking about, Scott. My analogy is I can see smoke coming out of their ears. They're thinking so hard about what they're trying to do and stuff, and sometimes I come up with something almost irrelevant to get them out of there. Yeah, you're right. I think it is kind of really limiting when you get really robotic in your movements, and that authenticity disappears, right? I think when you go, I think what I see, yeah.
I think that too, and when there's this idealized movement that the coaches maybe asked for or expecting, we're creating this almost dependence on the coach, this kind of almost like a learned helplessness, where if something goes wrong, they'll be, let's ask coach. And as much as possible, I try and reinforce to my team and my students, identifying the problems here is a superpower, because the solutions aren't generally that far behind. And so I'm feeling what's happening with the team. They're starting to understand the sport better, because they're now, I kind of know what happened there, because we're speaking about a lot of the same kind of strategies and tactics.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that those are really good points. And yeah, I see the same thing. And, we just have such this model of, I come to a class so you can tell me the answers, right? That's the way we learn, right? You, the coach, know all the way how to teach me how to throw a punch effectively. You're going to tell me, and I'm going to do it, practice it, and do it, right? That's just a model that's so drilled into us. And
it validates the coach as well, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yeah. Is that been a bit of a challenge for you, like kind of standing back and not, and letting go of control a bit of things?
Less so as it's gone on.
Yeah.
But definitely before, I was ready to jump in, or it wasn't even so much jump in and fix it, but I had to maybe demonstrate that, hey, I know things. I know things too.
Yeah.
I knew the answer to your problem. But again, and if someone wants to scrutinize one of my practices, I may be a little quick to jump in sometimes and offer the solution, especially if there's frustration. But I try my best to just nudge people and talk about it. But again, if I'm doing my job correctly and my partner's doing our job correctly, I think our students are starting to understand more, where they're less reliant on what we have to say. And it used to be very much a binary thing for me, that did it work or did it not work? And now, especially my striking classes for newer students, it's these little relationships that I see appearing that's my metric for success. So if someone's maybe throwing a kick towards their leg, is their leg just starting to come up and to defend it? They maybe didn't defend it successfully, but you just start to see these relationships appear, and that's really rewarding to me. In fact, I really get the most. The beginner's class is the most rewarding for me, to take someone who knows nothing and just seeing these relationships established. Yeah.
You're seeing the kind of the beginnings of searching for right, something that's going to work. Yeah. You're like, oh, you want to say you're walking down the right path. Keep going. Yeah. I have the same. Sometimes I agree. It's the really elite people are much harder to see very obvious, changes and things sometimes. Yeah. Yeah, but that's really so. I guess the last main thing I wanted to ask you about, Scott, is what advice would you have for people both in martial arts and other sports that kind of want to get into adopting this kind of approach, ecological approach, in terms of in the information and then how you actually put it into practice. That's a big question, but
well, it's such a cliche, right, to say trust the process, and I'm not necessarily finding this is a shortcut or quicker way. I don't know if it is quicker at all.
Yeah,
that might be the way I'm applying it. But the two things, there's all this talk now, and there's really a lot of traction here in my area of the sport. People talking about this now. I think my advice to any coach dabbling in here is to, of course, subscribe to the Perception Attitude podcast and get your head around, and I'm still trying, direct perception and what information means. And I think if you can get these two things, and then nothing else really makes sense, and that can be a real guiding star in your practice design. And I know it's going to happen, and I can see it happening already. It'll be, well, that's all very well, and this sounds really great, but we can have a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And I think the more I understand, or the more I see direct perception as being real, or that's the way we perceive, then the other stuff doesn't make sense to me. And I think that took me a long time. So I expect it'll take other coaches a long time.
Yeah. And then, like you said, I think before we were recording, it changes the way you see everything after a certain point. But it's not like something, I think, if you're going to do it really well, you can just jump right into. To do understanding why you're doing the things takes a little while, I think, for sure.
Yeah, and the last thing, you cover a lot of stuff in your books, and there's always another layer of the onion to peel back. But cueing and focus of attention, that's been a big one for us in getting athletes out their head and out of their bodies, and having a bit more external intention, focus.
Yeah, no, that can make a big change for sure. Yeah. So we mentioned my podcast, but you have a podcast too, Scott. I wanted to give you so can you tell us a little bit about that, where we can find out about more of the stuff you're doing?
Oh, yeah, surely. Well, I'm like the dollar store Perception Action podcast for MMA. However, I have had, including yourself, a lot of great guests on there. It started off as an endeavor just to broaden my understanding of things, but it was before a discussion where I dabbled in ecological dynamics. Now, for better or worse, I'm unashamedly just committed to exploring ecological dynamics for MMA further, and that is called the Primal MMA Coaching Podcast. They're always discussions with either coaches in the space or academics that are sometimes not in the space, but I have had a few that do martial arts too and whatnot. So it's been really interesting for me. And again, it's not just a vanity project. I get a lot out of it.
No, it's great, and I definitely recommend people check it out. So thanks for joining me, Scott. I really appreciate you telling us about your story.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all you do for us.
Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including a monthly coaches meetup, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled.
Gone straight away.